there's an awful lot one can talk about in terms of mobility, because mobility can be seen in different aspects, from the movement of people, geographical mobility, whether it's intranational or transnational, to interdisciplinary mobility, to intersectoral mobility and virtual mobility. The focus I'm going to keep is that of mobility beyond academia. In other words, mobility into employment as part of a PhD, and how that link can be made. And it's going back to the points that Neville made in his opening remarks, that the idea of preparing people for a career. And often, excuse me, and often it's not a question of people learning new skills, it's recognizing the fact that they have an awful lot of these skills acquired either through coursework or indeed through the very practice of the doctorate itself. Being managed in a very stressful situation, which they often won't find in many working environments. They're a lot more relaxed than doing their doctorate. I'm going to divide this into three parts. One is going to focus on policy, and one on practice, and the third on challenges. And in terms of the approach, I want to look at this from a European and international perspective rather than an Irish perspective, because there's an awful lot happening out there. There's a lot of data, which is really quite interesting. And there's some very interesting surveys and studies that have been carried on across Europe, which actually provide an awful lot of information, because they also provide the opportunity to compare and contrast, given the fact that Ireland is one of the EU 28 is always part of these types of surveys. Now, the first point I wanted to show you, the first data I wanted to show you, this is very kindly provided by the Higher Education Authority. This is a representation of the increase in the numbers of PhD candidates in Ireland from 1990 up to 2016. And what you can see, of course, is you can see the increases over time. Through the 90s up to about 2000, the principal reason why it increased was less due to national funding, because national funding for research is relatively small, but it was participation in European framework funding programs. And in fact, over those periods, for every framework program, Ireland's income doubled overall. We were very, very strong players. In fact, at one point, people used to say Irish researchers in Trinity were more likely to find colleagues and partners in Berlin or in Bratislava or in Budapest than they were in Cork or indeed in other parts of Dublin. That was simply the way it was. That's where you got the money. The shift comes around the late 90s and 2000s with the introduction of the Programme for Research in Third Level Institutions, the Foundation of Science Foundation Ireland, that really injected a vast amount of money into the system. And the system grew up to 2006. And it was only in 2006 that there was a real focus on strategy and development. And the arrow I have there is a strategy for science, technology, and innovation, which is to run from 06 to 2013. The core target was to double the number of doctoral graduates. It was a great catchphrase because it encapsulates in a single thing what you're doing, all the different activities in research. Now, it wasn't unique. Denmark did the same. A number of other countries used the same kind of measures. However, and the big however is, nobody thought about what was going to happen afterwards. So when you get your PhD, what happens next? That was no thought about. And I would say to a large extent in Innovation 2020, the current national policy, it's not really addressed either. Let's say it's addressed in a peripheral manner, but not in the core manner. Just in a European context, just to place Ireland in the European context, this is where we are now. If we're down there at about relatively small number, and interestingly enough, you see that the country with the largest number of doctoral candidates is Germany. Some people would often assume it's the United Kingdom, but it's actually Germany, followed by the UK and then France. You see the sequencing after that. Now, despite all the issues and problems and things that are discussed in terms of PhDs, one of the factors which people often forget is that, of course, the employment rates of PhD graduates are very high. Even in countries where there are many issues around employment, even if you go to some of the so-called new member states, if you go to Bulgaria, Romania, and that where countries where they have many, many issues, still employment rates among PhD graduates are still very high. Now, the first piece of data I want to show you is there's a study carried out across 9 institutions in Europe. And this is done by the European Science Foundation quite recently. And there's a number of organisations, the Technical University of Munich, the Institute of Science and Technology in Austria, the University of Luxembourg, the Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology, University of Split. There's a number of organisations. What they looked at was, they looked at the employment status of their doctoral holders after their doctorate. Firstly, in 1 to 2 years, 3 to 4 years, 5 to 7 years. And what you see is that while a substantial number are in permanent employment, there are still numbers, even after 5 to 7 years, you've got 20% of people who are in temporary part-time positions. Now, I'd underline as well that the countries you're dealing with on the whole, Netherlands, Austria, Luxembourg, Germany, are in systems which are very well funded. I mean, Germany in particular has a very long tradition of people going into full-time employment with their doctorate in a relevant position. So these numbers are probably high in that sense. If you brought in more European countries, I think you'd check that picture, you'd change. Now, this is another interesting one too. The relationship between the work that people are doing and their doctorate. And what you can see here, the red bars there are saying, yes, what they're doing is closely related. And in universities and research performing organisations, then yes, most people, but 25% are partially related. And this is typical where you get people who have doctorates, they get work in universities, but they're not doing research anymore. They may be in the research support office. Yes, their PhD is relevant because they are supporting researchers finding funding, etc. But it's not their core activity. That's the point. Now, as you move out of the university sector, you see, you go to industry, 46%, even quarter, not at all related. Service or business sectors, 43%, no relation whatsoever to what they're doing. Now, I mean, in a way, one could contest that, because yes, it's not related to the piece of research they did, but the qualities they acquired in terms of their personal attributes and capabilities and skills they acquired during their PhD, I would contest, are most certainly relevant. And finally, from the same study, the minimum education requirement for their current job. So what was the minimum education requirement? Now, in the university, you see the high blues, the doctorate. You needed a doctorate. But of course, as you move out into industry, the service sectors, business sectors, government, hospitals, other sectors, that drops. The primary degree requirement would have been the master's degree. So that opens up more that whole issue about, yes, high employment, but is that employment relevant? And I think, of course, there is a bottom line here in the sense that for many people, in terms of numbers, in terms of the fact that there has been such a drive over the last 30 years to invest more in research for long-term economic and social growth, that you produce large numbers of PhDs with the realization from day one that most of them will not end up in a research position, but yet the system still drives an academic apprenticeship. So what about policy? Well, at European level, there's one key policy initiative in terms of all of research across Europe, which is the European Research Area, which was originally founded in the year 2000. And the idea was that following the single market from 1992 for the free movement of goods, services across Europe, the single market for research, the free movement of researchers and knowledge across Europe was from 2000. In 2005, there was the European Charter for Researchers. And even then, it was very clearly recognised that employers and funders must recognise the value of geographical, intersectoral, interdisciplinary, as well as mobility between the public and private sectors, and the private sectors in the broadest sense. And so in fundamental European policy in terms of research funding and that, it's fully recognised. For the recruitment of researchers, and this is another critical aspect, because researchers will always ask, what's the benefit, what's the point of doing part of my PhD in industry? Will it get me a job in academia? Will it be taken into account? Will I get publications? If I don't get publications, I ain't going to get my citations and impact factor, and therefore I won't get a job as a researcher. So that factor comes into, and again, in the Code of Conduct for the Recruitment of Researchers in 2005, it stated very clearly that the full ranges of experience of research should be taken into account during either recruitment but also career progression as well. So how are those policies implemented, certainly at European level? Well, there's a number of initiatives. Oops, sorry. And if we focus that a little bit more on the doctorate, which is what we're talking about today, in 2005, the European Universities Association launched the Salzburg Agreement, which was a statement of principles around the doctorate itself. And it was the first time they had done it on a collective basis across Europe. The EUA has about 7,000 members right across Europe. Now, the fundamental, very clear statement in all these policies has been that the doctorate was fundamentally a piece of original research that results in a thesis. Theses may be different depending what country you're from, whether it's a collection of peer-reviewed publications or a single piece of work which is then published elsewhere. But that was the fundamental principle. But in addition to that, there was a very clear recognition that there was the need to engage with other stakeholders, the need to recognize the fact that people would move out of the doctorate, out of the academic environment, into other environments for work. In 2011, the European Commission developed the Principles for Innovative Doctoral Training. There are 7 of those, and one of them is about exposure to industry and other relevant employment sectors as part of the doctorate. Now, what's interesting there is that, and this is one thing where the European funding programs can be very powerful, is that this is policy, but the policy is also practice. Because these principles were taken and they were put into the European funding programs themselves, into the so-called framework programs, which used to be 4 years, they're now 6-7-year programs. The first thing is that in the current program, Horizon 2020, running from 2014 to 2020, the European Researchers Charter and Code is actually embedded in the model contract. You may not know it, but if you're involved in a Horizon 2020 contract, then Article 32A states explicitly that all researchers must be hired, that the Charter and Code must be respected in that contract. Now, whether it is or it isn't is another story. But whether it's monitored or it's not monitored. But the point is, it is part of the deal. It's part of the contract that this should happen. The second thing is, for those of you, many of you may be aware that there's also the Human Resources and Research Award, which is given by the European Commission, and it's given to institutions that explicitly apply for it, showing how they implement the Charter and Code in terms of how they recruit researchers and how they provide skills training, professional development for researchers, and how they also enable them then to have career progression, taking that into account. There are EURAXES in 2004, there are the so-called EURAXES service centres across Europe that provide support to researchers moving. And very recently, there's been a whole new development in terms of developing career development centres across Europe as well, to provide researchers with more issues around intersectoral mobility and career options. So there's quite a piece of work going on at European level. But in terms of funding, there are 2 notable programs that have always supported the whole principles around intersectoral mobility, are the Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions. Now, the training networks, which are doctoral training networks, have been in existence for over 30 years. And the co-fund program is more recent. It's been there since 2014, since the most recent program. The first thing is that the Innovative Doctoral Training principles, all of them, are part of the evaluation criteria for these funding streams. So you must actually show in your proposal that you're going to do all of these things to make it happen. Simple as that. Now, in Europe, across Europe, there's many examples of funding which promotes intersectoral mobility. The Irish Research Council's Enterprise Partnership Scheme, Danish Industrial PhD Scheme. The Danes have produced a very good report for anybody who's interested last year on a long-term study of their doctoral graduates and that, which is excellent. And German structured doctoral programs, which are funded by the German DRK, with the Helmholtz and Leibniz Institutes in Germany. But coming back to the Marie Curie networks, this is a very interesting story. Because up until about 2002, 2003, these were purely academic networks. They were just universities, research centres across Europe. You could have a non-academic partner, but it wasn't necessary. It was made necessary for Framework 7, Framework 6, 7, and Horizon 2020. People said, oh, it won't work, we'll never find industry partners, it's not going to happen, we won't be able to do this, how could we work with industry, how could we work with the non-academic sector? In 2018, there were 1,400 proposals to the scheme, which would mean they engaged about, even the schemes have 8 to 10 partners in each one of them. They had about 12 to 15,000 research teams in universities and companies and other types of organisations, museums and libraries, etc., right across Europe, all applying for this programme. The success rate is 4%. It's one of the most hotly contested schemes and popular schemes in Europe. And it really is one where it has grabbed the interest of scientists, researchers in all disciplines across Europe. So the idea that this doesn't work, that it's hard to do, is not true. It can be done, and it can be done very well. An example there is one from NUI Galway, and I didn't do that, I didn't know Lucy was going to be here leading the graduate studies in Galway, but this is one called PathSense. And this will deliver 13 PhD graduates. And the network itself is 8 universities, public research institutions, 4 companies, all involved in this. There's the NUI Galway, the University of Regensburg, the Rijksuniversiteit Groningen, CSIC Spain, Uni Cambridge, Ernst Morris Arndt University of Greifswald, Goulet in Sweden. There's a whole load of organisations across Europe that are involved. And these students, the people who are actually on these PhDs, will be moving to these, they will spend time in companies as part of their training, part of their research. They'll have a very, very varied experience, and when they come out with their PhD, they will be highly employable, and they will have seen life beyond the 4 walls of the university, which will give them an awful lot of opportunities. And there are many of those similar schemes operating across and funded by the European Union. This is a German example I like a lot. I worked in Karlsruhe for a number of years, and the KIT was founded. It became one of Germany's centres of excellence, founded under their Excellence Initiative. This is a graduate programme on service research. It's funded by IBM, Bosch, and the Forschungszentrum Informatik in Germany. It's for researchers doing their PhD. They have a primary supervisor in the Karlsruhe Institute. They have an industry mentor. They will have a compulsory research day at an international industry partner for 4 to 6 months in their second year. They have an integrated course. This is a typical doctoral program. But the interesting thing is it's funded by industry. And there are many such examples in Germany of these kinds. This is a particularly nice one because it's not in the usual disciplines, it's not in the usual STEM subjects, it's outside of those. And you will find quite a number of these across Germany, these kind of programs. They're very effective because the graduates, probably Germany in one sense is a bad example because they have had these long-standing relationships between industry and academia right across Germany. Well, indeed, the Netherlands will be the same. I mean, often you would say that Delft University, Shell University, or Leiden University, as Gareth is from, is actually Philips University, because that's a very, very strong links. But their universities, for example, at Leiden, they would have joint appointments between professors who were jointly appointed as vice presidents in Philips and university full-time professors as well. So those links are very powerful and very strong. The real challenge is, of course, how do you embed those in systems that don't have that kind of tradition? Now some more data for your entertainment. The Moore study, this is the third. It was Moore 1, 2, and this is Moore 3. It's carried out by the European Commission, and this is a survey of over 10,000 researchers across Europe. So a pretty comprehensive survey. And what's really interesting about this, and I think it's always important to look at data because you hear a lot of talk, you get certain impressions about things. Everybody talks about structured doctoral programs, about the old system of academic apprenticeship of one student, one supervisor, etc., etc. And there's this idea generated that it's all gone, it's in the past. But the fact of the matter is it's not. 56% of doctoral candidates across Europe are still on the old-fashioned single supervisor system. It's as simple as that, despite all the nice things you hear. 15% yes are in doctoral schools, nearly 30% have supervisory committees. Now that can mean, a supervisory committee can mean a lot of different things. Doctoral schools, at least, you have a reasonable idea about what you mean by that. So, more than half of doctoral candidates across Europe are in the old system. That is quite difficult, in fact, unless you have the supervisor has good relationships with non-academic organisations where people have placements or any kind of internships. And it works very well with doctoral schools because this can be really well organised in a structured manner where you have partners of companies. If you look at the skills training that people get across Europe, you're looking at 33% of PhD candidates are getting training. Now, there's often this assumption, again about training and skills, everybody gets it. They don't. It's only a third of researchers across Europe. Again, this is based on pretty good data. And there you see the majority of the skills they acquire are in the area of research, disciplinary research skills, whether people are going in doing special statistics courses or whatever. Ones on ethics have increased, and which is unsurprising. And the other one I didn't realise, 60% nearly are getting ones on proposal writing, and entrepreneurship at 38%. Some interesting data then on career progression is that across Europe, let's say average completion times for PhDs about 4.7 years. Now, remember, this is across all disciplines, all countries, so it's highly varied. If you read the report, you will find country data in there as well, more detailed information per country. Last piece of data I'll give you here on this. Researchers were asked about their impressions, because remember, what did they think was going to be important in terms of career progression and recruitment? And one thing you see is at the bottom of this is intersectoral mobility. That being said, there was still about 57, 58% were saying that these things were important as far as career progression and recruitment is concerned. That's quite an interesting piece of data as well. And even though it's low down, it's still in this pyramid. I mean, the international mobility is seen as the highest, followed by transferable skills, alternative forms of research output, interdisciplinary mobility, intersectoral. In terms of internships outside of academia for researchers, for PhDs, this is the data here, and it gives it about 12.9%. Let's say 13% of doctoral candidates in Ireland have internships of whatever type outside of academia. What's interesting when you look at the data is the countries with the highest amounts. I mean, Denmark is particularly high at 32%, but they've always had a drive to have strong relationships between academia and, in particular, industry in Denmark. But the eastern countries in Europe have always been very high as well. If you look at, say, Bulgaria, 25%, Croatia, 32%, 46% for the Czech Republic. But this is also due to histories. The history of how industry was viewed in the let's say, in the communist period up to 1990, before the fall of the Berlin Wall. That those links were always very strong. So it's not particularly surprising there. So the question is, can you change this? Can you change the system in a way? Because when you look at some of the parameters that are there, you have a situation where the doctoral candidate registers in the university, walks in the door, but within the four walls of the university for the 3 to 4 to 5 years they're doing their doctorate. The supervisor is an academic. Now there's some expectation by people, their supervisor should tell them about careers outside academia. Yeah. Well, if you get apprenticed to a plumber, after 2 years, the plumber's hardly likely to tell you how to go become a banker. It's the same idea. Academics are not competent for this job. It's not what they do. And they shouldn't be made to do. To me, it's very simple. However, what there does need to be the space now, protected space for doctoral candidates to have those opportunities. Because often that's their biggest issue, is that the research so much dominates, especially, and this goes back to the people outside structured doctoral programs. They're sort of, They're third in the firing line in the sense that most of PhD candidates are funded through projects, large-scale projects. They're not, they don't have direct funding. There's very small amounts of direct scholarship type funding for PhDs. There's some for structured doctoral training, but most people are out of that zone, and they only see their supervisor. They're on a research project. There are demands to be met. There's KPIs. There's outputs all to be reached. So their value is simply to be, if you really wanted to put it in a certain way, the reform of indentured labour. Because remember, if you don't do what you're told, you won't get a good recommendation to get another job. You can't leave without your passport out. You can't get your passport out. You can't get your PhD until you do all the work. And you get paid, you get lousy pay in those places. So really, the idea that you can that supervisors know is not their job, and it should never be made their job to do it. But certainly for doctoral candidates, the space needs to be made and the opportunities for them to be able to do these things through skills training and through opportunities for internships. So, you know, coming back to the numbers, this is I like this data here. This is the UNESCO science report, and it says the world population of researchers has increased by 21%. To a total of 7.5 million across the world. Europe has the highest percentage, 22.2%. We're followed closely by China and then the United States. But the number of academic and research positions has not increased in the same way at all. Good example, this is data from the United States. This is the National Science Foundation. The National Science Foundation are great. They track stuff from the 1970s. And what you see there is, on the blue curves, is the increase in the number of PhD graduates. On the sort of orangey curves is the increase in the number of academic positions in the United States, in the STEM, this is the STEM subject. This is the piece from Nature Biotechnology, and the references up there at the top. But you know, you just look at the graph, you see it straight away. You see the split, the move away from this, the increase in the numbers of PhD graduates as compared to the number of academic positions. Now we come back to intersectoral mobility. I think it's good to look at the pros and cons of it. I say, well, what's a good thing? What are the barriers? Now, on experience, all of the funding agencies across Europe who would fund PhD internships in say, the AFR in France, the Danish National Funding Agency, the FNR in Luxembourg, the DFA in Germany, they all say very clearly that over time, their graduates are highly employable straight away after their doctorate by the companies they have been working with, or indeed by other organizations as well. It also generates greater industry-academic collaborations. It can bring employers into helping design courses, specific skills courses as well. They can bring their expertise to the table as well. And also, of course, to actually having employers funding doctoral programs. As we see, there's many in Germany that do that. However, if you look, I'll come back to the Irish situation now. What are the barriers? And one of the things is getting access to employers in relevant areas. When you look across the disciplines that are available in the universities, in terms of research itself, there's a very limited number of research active companies in Ireland. This does contrast significantly with other countries, where there's actually high numbers of well-established research active companies. The capacity of company staff then to actually host and supervise doctoral candidates for any period of areas of internship. The dangers always of internships becoming simply a substitute for company labour, of people actually just being brought in to do a job, which is actually not or related to their doctorate. Not having that work integrated into a doctoral program. Something that really does need to be planned at the beginning of the whole process, not something you tag on at the end just to get a bit of money from some funding agency. This has got to be something that's really integral to the whole program itself. So, are there any solutions? Well, it just so happens that I was doing some work last year and earlier this year with the European Marine Board. And this is a conglomerate of all the funding agencies across Europe that fund marine research. and a number of companies and a number of universities and research organisations across Europe. The Marine Institute in Ireland will be a member of this. And we have developed a report now on training the 21st century marine profession, because their problem again is they want to have closer links with the whole marine sector in terms of training their doctoral candidates, so that when they graduate, that they have a better ability to get employed to the broad marine sector, whether it's in research or whether it's outside research in areas that even from areas of fisheries, even to tourism. And with a number of high-level recommendations, there's more detailed ones in there. Okay, the first one was modernise all the graduate training programs that already exist. Develop training content by engaging with the wider marine community across academia, government and industry. Maximise recruitment of students and professionals. Advance the European higher education area for marine science and technology. Deliver relevant policy support initiatives and establish long-term flexible funding instruments. I think one of the important things down here is engaging more with the relevant stakeholders and having relevant funding instruments as well are the two things. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.